My mom wants me to impersonate my twin at her wedding after an accident, but I won't play along. My twin sister Marin was in a car accident 46 hours before her wedding, and my mom called me from the hospital at 2 in the morning, and the first thing out of her mouth was not how Marin was doing. It was how long the event deposit was non-refundable. I want you to hold that for a second. 46 hours, 2 in the morning, first sentence. The second sentence was the one that made me pull over, which was, you two look identical on camera, nobody would know, you walk in her place, we do the ceremony, we tell Tobias when Marin is better. Tobias is the groom. My mom was proposing that her son impersonate his twin sister at a legally binding wedding, and she said it the way you'd suggest a restaurant. Like the main objection was logistics. I told her I am a 6'2" man, and Marin is 5'4", and the dress was not going to cooperate. My mom said Tobias's family was very traditional, and if the wedding didn't happen on the scheduled date, the financial arrangement between the families would dissolve, and when I asked what financial arrangement she got quiet, and then she said it was a business matter and not my concern, and that was the sentence that made me understand something had been happening in my family that I was not aware of. I drove to the hospital. Marin was awake, barely, concussed and scared, and the first thing she said when she saw me was not, I'm glad you're here, it was, don't let them do the thing. And I said, what thing? And she closed her eyes and said, the money thing, the wedding thing, the whole thing. And when I pressed her, she said she was too tired now, that she needed me to just stay, and I sat beside her bed and held her hand and thought about the phrase financial arrangement and the phrase the whole thing, and what the intersection of those two phrases implied about my sister's wedding. Then she grabbed my arm and said she had been trying to get out of this wedding for 3 months and nobody would listen, and that the accident had happened on her way home from a meeting with a lawyer, and that the lawyer had documents. The dumber they think I am, the more rope they'll hand me. Tobias came to the hospital the next morning. I was in the hallway when he arrived, and I watched his face when the nurse told him Marin was awake and asking for space, and his face did not do what you'd expect a groom's face to do. It went flat and calculating for about 1 second before he composed it back into concern, and 1 second is enough if you're watching for it. He saw me. He came over and shook my hand too firmly, and he said, she's going to be okay, that's what matters. And I said yes, and then he said, we can still make this work on Saturday. And I said, I wasn't sure that was Marin's priority right now, and he said quietly, it needs to be, and the needs to be was not about love, it was about something else entirely. I called the lawyer whose name was in Marin's phone calendar. I said I was her twin, and she'd asked me to make contact. The lawyer said she couldn't speak to me without Marin's authorization. I said I understood, and then I asked whether there was a provision in the prenuptial agreement that would send money back to Tobias's family if the wedding didn't occur. And the pause was so long I thought the call had dropped, and then the lawyer said, very carefully, I would encourage your sister when she's able to come in and finalize the authorization we discussed before Saturday. I drove back to the hospital. My mom was in the hall outside Marin's room with the garment bag over her arm, and a look on her face like a woman who has made a decision and would prefer not to be argued with. And she held out the bag and said, it's just one afternoon, it's just a ceremony, it doesn't have to mean anything. And I looked at the bag and I said, put it down. And she said, the money. And I said, put it down. And she set the bag on the chair and sat beside it and put her hands on her knees. And behind her, through the window in the door, I could see Marin's face. And Marin was watching us. And she was on her phone. And when mine buzzed a second later, it was her. One text that said, the authorization is sent. She'll talk to you now. There's more than the prenup. There's a lot more. I picked up my phone and walked to the end of the hallway and dialed. And the lawyer answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting. Paisley didn't waste time with small talk. She said the prenup was only the surface layer. Underneath it, there was a separate agreement, a side deal, signed by Virginia on behalf of our family, that tied a large financial obligation directly to the marriage going through. If the wedding did not happen by the date written in the contract, which was Saturday, our family owed Tobias's family a penalty so big it would wipe us out, not inconvenience us, not set us back, destroy us. I asked how much, and Paisley gave me a number, and I'm not going to put it here, but it was the kind of number that makes your ears ring. I said, how long has Marin known about this? Paisley said Marin found out about the side agreement only 2 months ago. Before that, Marin had no idea the penalty existed. She thought the engagement was just a family partnership thing, and the wedding was part of it, but not in a way that had a dollar amount attached to her walking away. When Marin found out about the penalty clause, that was when everything changed. Paisley said Marin spent weeks trying to handle it the quiet way. She went to Virginia over and over and asked her to dissolve the arrangement. Virginia said no every single time. Marin asked Paisley to draft a formal withdrawal letter. Paisley drafted it, but before it could be sent, Virginia found out and called Tobias's family directly and told them Marin was just having cold feet, that everything was still on track. Marin was boxed in. She couldn't go forward because she didn't want the marriage. She couldn't go backward because Virginia kept closing the door behind her. The documents Marin mentioned were bigger than the prenup. Marin had spent the last several weeks gathering evidence that she was pushed into the engagement under false pretenses. Virginia had told Marin this was a simple partnership between families and had never told Marin about the penalty clause before Marin agreed to the engagement. Paisley said the argument was misrepresentation. Virginia signed on behalf of the family but never gave Marin the full picture before getting Marin's agreement. That meant the whole foundation of the deal was built on something Marin didn't actually consent to, but there was a catch. Marin had to sign the final filing herself, in person, and it had to be submitted before Saturday. Saturday was not just a wedding date, it was the contractual deadline written into the side agreement. If the wedding happened on Saturday, Marin was locked in. If the wedding didn't happen and the documents weren't filed before Saturday, the penalty would trigger automatically. The only way out was to get Marin's signature on Paisley's filing before Saturday and get it submitted to the court. That was it. That was the whole board. I walked back to Marin's room. She was more alert now, sitting up a little. I pulled the chair close and sat down and told her everything. The side agreement, the penalty, the deadline, the fact that Virginia had signed it on behalf of the family, the fact that the withdrawal letter never made it out because Virginia killed it. I told her all of it, and I watched her face while I did, and her face didn't change the way you'd expect. She looked tired in a way that goes deeper than not sleeping. She looked like someone who had been carrying something so heavy for so long that hearing someone else describe the weight weight of it was almost a relief. She said, now you see it. Now you see what I've been living in. I sat with that for a second. Then I asked her why she didn't come to me sooner. Why she went to a lawyer before she went to her own brother. She looked at me and she said, because mom told me you'd side with her. She said you always do. That one landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. Because the thing is, I couldn't say she was wrong. Not completely. I was the one who smoothed things over with Virginia, who said, she means well. And that's just how mom is. And Marin had watched me do that for years and decided, probably correctly, that if it came down to her word against our mothers, I would find a reason to make it okay for Virginia. I always found a reason. I looked at my sister in that hospital bed and I said, I'm not siding with anyone except you. Not mom, not Tobias, not anyone. You tell me what you need and that's what happens. She said Paisley could bring the documents to the hospital. She could sign them right here. But then she grabbed my wrist, the way she used to when we were kids, and she wanted me to really pay attention. And she said, I need someone to make sure nobody walks in here and stops me while I'm signing. Mom will try. Tobias will try. They'll show up and they'll have reasons and they'll make it sound like I'm the one being crazy. I need you in this room when it happens. Can you do that? I said yes. I wasn't going anywhere. I called Paisley back that night, sitting in the chair next to Marin's bed while she slept. I kept my voice low and told Paisley we needed her at the hospital first thing in the morning with the documents ready to sign. Paisley said she could be there by 9. I pulled the chair closer to the wall and I stayed. I woke up at 6 in the morning to a voice, a careful one, a practiced one. Virginia was standing over Marin's bed, leaning close, holding Marin's hand between both of hers. Marin was barely awake, still groggy from the medication, and Virginia was speaking in this soft, steady tone saying, you don't have to do anything, sweetheart. I'll handle everything. Just let Saturday happen and then we'll figure it out after. I sat up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. Virginia didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on Marin like she could finish the job if she just had 10 more seconds. I said, get away from her. Virginia turned her head and looked at me, and whatever warmth she'd been performing for Marin just left her face like someone flipped a switch. She said, this is not your business. I stood up and said, you made it my business when you called me at 2 in the morning asking me to commit fraud. Virginia's mouth tightened. She said if this fell apart, the family lost everything. She said she did what she had to do to protect us. I looked at her standing there in my sister's hospital room at 6 in the morning, trying to talk a concussed woman into walking down an aisle she'd been running from for 3 months, and I said, you didn't protect Marin, you sold her. Virginia's hands dropped to her sides. She looked at me for a long second and then she walked out of the room. She didn't walk far. I stepped into the hallway and watched her go to the waiting area at the end of the floor and sit down in one of those plastic chairs and pull out her phone. She wasn't leaving. She was regrouping. I went back to Marin. She was awake now, really awake, and she was shaking a little, not a lot, just enough that I could see it in her hands. She said, she does this every time you step out. She comes in and she holds my hand and she cycles through them. Guilt first, then fear, then obligation, then back to guilt. She's been doing it since I got here. The nurses don't know what to say because she's my mother and she's calm and she's not technically doing anything wrong. I looked at the door and then back at Marin and I understood something clearly. I could not leave her alone, not for 5 minutes, because Virginia was sitting 50 feet away waiting for me to blink. I called Sherlock. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice rough with sleep. I said, I need you at the hospital. I need you to sit in a room and not move and I'll explain when you get here. He didn't ask why. He said, which hospital? He was there in 35 minutes. Sherlock walked into Marin's room with a coffee in each hand and I pulled him into the corner and gave him the short version. My sister was being pressured into a marriage she didn't want. My mother was part of it. There were legal documents coming in the morning that would fix it, but I needed someone in this room with Marin at all times because Virginia was down the hall waiting to get Marin alone. Sherlock listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he looked at Marin, looked at the door, looked at the chair by the bed, and sat down in it. He said, I'm not moving from this chair until you tell me to. With Sherlock in the room, I could breathe. I stepped into the hallway to check my phone, and that's when the real problem showed up. The elevator opened and Tobias walked out. He wasn't alone. There was a man with him in a dark suit with a leather folder under his arm. They walked toward me with purpose, and Tobias's face was set in that practiced look of calm concern that I'd seen crack once before. He stopped in front of me and said, I want to see my fiancée. I said, Marin asked for space. She's resting. Then he gestured to the man beside him and said, this is our family's attorney. He has paperwork that Marin agreed to sign before the accident. We'd like to get that taken care of today. I understood what was happening with a kind of clarity that felt almost physical. Tobias was here to get Marin's signature on something before Paisley could walk through that door with the documents that would void everything. He was racing the same clock I was, and he'd brought his own pen. I planted myself in that hallway and said, Marin is concussed. She's on medication. Nobody is signing anything today. Tobias leaned in, not close enough to be threatening, but close enough that the attorney couldn't hear, and he said quietly, you have no idea what happens to your family if this doesn't go through. Your mother knows. Ask her. I held his eyes and I said, I know about the penalty clause. I watched the words land. I watched them rearrange something behind his face. He blinked once, slow, and I could see him recalculating, adjusting whatever script he had walked in here with because it didn't account for me knowing that. He recovered fast. He steered me toward the window at the end of the hallway and dropped his voice and said, you think I want this? My family set this up. Your mother set this up. Marin and I are both in it. The difference is I accepted it and she didn't. If this falls apart, it's not just your family that gets hurt. For 1 second, just one, I saw something in his eyes that looked real. Actual fear. The kind of fear that comes from knowing you're a piece on someone else's board and the hand that moves you doesn't care if you break. For that 1 second, I almost felt something close to sympathy. Then he said, so let me in that room, let her sign, and we all walk away clean on Saturday. And whatever I'd felt disappeared. I said, clean for who? He didn't answer. I turned to the nurse at the station and said, can you confirm whether Marin Odell has a visitor restriction on her room? The nurse looked at her screen, clicked twice, and said, she's listed as approved visitors only. I have 2 names on the list. I said, is his name on it? I nodded toward Tobias. The nurse said, no. Tobias heard it. I know he heard it because his shoulders changed, just barely, just enough. He looked at me one more time, the kind of look that's supposed to make you feel the weight of what's coming, and then he turned and walked back toward the elevator. elevator. I watched him stop in the elevator lobby and pull out his phone before the doors even opened. That call was for Virginia. 20 minutes later, Virginia appeared around the corner near the vending machines. She'd been crying. Her eyes were red and her cheeks were blotchy, but her jaw was set in that way I knew from childhood. The way that meant she wasn't done. She was just switching to a different gear. She stepped in front of me and she said, "If you blow this up, we lose the house. We lose everything I built for this family. Is that what you want? To be the one who destroyed us?" I said, "You destroyed this when you signed Marin's life away without telling her the truth." Virginia went quiet, the kind of quiet that means someone just heard the thing they were hoping nobody would say out loud. She said very softly, "She would have come around." I shook my head. I said, "She was in a lawyer's office the day she got hit. She was never coming around." Virginia turned and walked away, and I let her go because Paisley was supposed to be here any minute, and I needed to be in that lobby when she arrived. Paisley came through the doors at 9:15 with a leather bag over her shoulder and the kind of calm, purposeful walk that told me she had done this before. I walked her up to Marin's room. When I opened the door, Sherlock was still in the chair exactly where I'd left him. Marin was sitting up. She was alert. She was waiting. Paisley pulled the chair up to the bedside table and opened the folder and laid out the documents one by one, explaining each page. She said the argument was misrepresentation. Virginia had not disclosed the penalty terms to Marin before Marin agreed to the engagement. The case was clean and solid, but it had to be filed before Saturday because once the contractual deadline passed without either the wedding happening or the filing being submitted, the penalty would trigger on its own, automatically, and there would be nothing anyone could do to stop it. Marin listened to all of it. She asked one question, which was whether Virginia could challenge the filing, and Paisley said she could try, but the evidence was strong. Marin nodded. She picked up the pen. Her hand was shaking. Not a lot, but enough that I could see it from where I was standing by the door. She looked at me across the room and I could see everything in her face. The fear and the relief and the exhaustion and the weight of 3 months of trying to scream in a room where nobody would let her make noise. I nodded. She looked back down at the papers and she signed her name, and the pen shook the whole time, but the signature was clear, and when she set the pen down, she let out a breath that sounded like it had been stuck in her chest since the day she found out what our mother had done. Paisley gathered the documents into her folder, checked each page one more time and said, "I'm filing this today. You'll hear from me before 5. She walked out and the door clicked shut and the room got very quiet. Then Marin started to cry, not loud, quiet and slow, tears running down her face while she just sat there breathing. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, 3 months. 3 months I tried to tell Mom and she kept saying it would work out, that Tobias was a good man." Paisley called the next afternoon and said the filing was accepted, the side agreement was void, the wedding was canceled, and there was no penalty coming. Tobias's family's attorney had sent a letter stating they considered the matter closed, probably because the misrepresentation evidence would have looked worse for them in court than just walking away. 2 days later I drove Marin home from the hospital. She was quiet for most of the ride, looking out the window. Then she said, "I thought I was going to have to do it. I really thought nobody was going to stop it." I kept my eyes on the road and said, "You stopped it. You went to the lawyer. You sent the authorization." I just answered the phone. She said, "You answered at 2 in the morning. That counts." Virginia didn't call for 3 weeks. When she finally did, she didn't mention the wedding or the money. She asked if Marin was eating. It wasn't enough, but it was different. 7 weeks after the filing, a certified letter arrived at Marin's apartment, addressed to her and forwarded to me by mistake because the address was slightly off. The return address was a law office in a city 2 states over, a name neither of us recognized. Inside was a single document, a declaration from a notary, and attached to it was a list of 6 names. 2 of the names I didn't recognize. One name was Tobias's, one name was Virginia's, and the last 2 names on the list were mine and Marin's. We were listed as signatories to an agreement dated 11 months ago, 4 months before Marin and Tobias even got engaged. I called Paisley. I read her the document over the phone, word for word. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That's your mother's handwriting on the notary line, isn't it?" It was.